Hello, everyone. I am Albert Einstein, and this is my story. I was born on March 14th, 1879, in Ulm, a small city in Germany. My parents were Hermann Einstein, a salesman and engineer, and Pauline Koch. I wasn't a particularly quick child. In fact, I started speaking later than most, which worried my parents a bit. I was known for being quiet and thoughtful, and people often thought of me as a slow learner. A moment I remember vividly, and one that shaped my whole life, happened when I was about 5 years old. I was sick in bed, and my father gave me a magnetic compass. The mystery of the needle always pointing north, moved by some invisible force, absolutely fascinated me. It felt like a deep secret was hidden in that little instrument, a secret about how the world works, and I was hooked. When I was 6, my parents moved to Munich for my father's business. My formal schooling began there, but I found the strict, disciplined atmosphere of the German schools very difficult. The rote learning and the demand for unquestioning obedience clashed with my natural curiosity and desire to ask why. I prefer to learn at my own pace and in my own way. My favorite pastime wasn't playing with other children, but rather building complex structures with building blocks and solving puzzles. I was introverted, often keeping to myself. My sister, Maya, was born when I was 2, and we were very close throughout our lives. She was really my only playmate in those early years. My mother, an excellent pianist, gave me violin lessons starting around age 6. I initially hated them. It was only when I realized the beauty and logic in the structure of music, particularly the works of Mozart and Bach, that I truly began to love the violin. Music became a lifelong comfort and an integral part of my thinking process. I often said that if I weren't a physicist, I'd be a musician. Teenage years and struggles, my father's business wasn't very stable. In 1894, when I was 15, his electrical engineering company failed, and the family moved to Pavia, Italy, near Milan, to start a new venture. My parents decided I should stay behind in Munich to finish my studies. It was a miserable time. I was alone, hated the school, and felt trapped by the rigidity of the education system. After only 6 months, I couldn't stand it anymore. I convinced my parents to let me leave school, claiming a nervous condition, and I joined them in Pavia. It was a bold and unconventional move, but it was a great relief to be free of that suffocating environment. My goal was to enter the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, the ETH, in Zurich, one of the best technical universities. However, since I hadn't finished high school, I had to take an entrance exam in 1895. I failed the non-science sections, things like languages and history. I did brilliantly in the maths and science sections, though, which impressed the principal. He advised me to get high school diploma first and recommended a school in Aarau, Switzerland. The year I spent in Aarau was one of the happiest of my youth. The Swiss school was completely different from the German one. It encouraged independent thinking and freedom. I lived with the family of my teacher, Jost Winteller, and found a supportive and warm atmosphere. I renounced my German citizenship at this time to avoid compulsory military service, and for several years, I was stateless. In 1896, I successfully entered the ETH in Zurich. I was studying to become a secondary school teacher of physics and mathematics. University life was much better. I met brilliant students and professors, though I still had a rebellious streak. I often skipped lectures, preferring to study the great masters of physics on my own rather than following the prescribed curriculum. I knew what I needed to learn, and I hated being told what to do. This habit meant that one of my professors, Heinrich Weber, disliked me, and it would later come back to haunt me. One of my fellow students was Miliva Merrick, a bright young Serbian woman, the only female in my physics class. We fell in love, bonded by our shared passion for science and music. This was a deep, intense connection, but one that was strongly opposed by my family, particularly my mother, who felt Miliva was too old, too serious, and not Jewish. The miracle year and early hardship, I graduated in 1900, but because of my rebellious attitude, the professor who disliked me refused to write a recommendation for me. This made getting a job impossible. It was a period of intense struggle and humiliation. I was a brilliant graduate with no work. I took odd tutoring jobs, living in poverty, and sending applications everywhere, which were all rejected. My father even wrote letters on my behalf, begging for jobs for his son. It was incredibly painful for him to see me struggle. My father died in 1902, and his passing was one of the deepest sorrows of my life. He was always supportive of me, even when he didn't understand my scientific ideas. In 1902, I finally secured a steady job, thanks to a friend's father. I became a patent examiner at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. The job was perfect. It required me to evaluate inventions, which meant a lot of deep thinking about practical physics problems. The work was interesting enough to pay the bills, but not so demanding that it consumed all my time. I had my evenings and weekends free to pursue my true passion, physics. Miliva and I had a daughter out of wedlock in 1902 named Liesel. The circumstances of her life remain a mystery. It is believed she was either adopted or died of scarlet fever as an infant. This was a sad, difficult secret that weighed heavily on both of us. Miliva and I married in 1903. The marriage was simple, and we settled into a small apartment in Bern. We had two sons. Hans Albert was born in 1904, and Edouard was born in 1910. Then came the year that changed everything, 1905. While still working at the patent office, I wrote and published 4 groundbreaking scientific papers, all within a few months. This is now famously known as my Annus Mirabilis, or miracle year. I won't go into the details of the science, but these papers introduced concepts that fundamentally changed how we understand light, matter, time, and space. One of them contained the most famous equation in history, a simple formula that showed that mass and energy are two sides of the same coin. E equals mc squared. These ideas were radical, but I was so certain of their truth that I felt I was simply recording what nature had clearly laid out. Rise to fame, and personal turmoil, recognition was slow, but it eventually came. I defended my doctoral thesis and started to get noticed by other physicists. By 1908, I was hired as a lecturer at the University of Bern, and soon after, I quit the patent office. My academic career began to move quickly. I held professorships in Zurich, 1909, then Prague, 1911, and then back at the ETH in Zurich, 1912. Each move was a step up, recognizing the revolutionary nature of my work. This rapid ascent was thrilling, but the constant moving and my single-minded focus on physics began to strain my marriage to Maliva. She was a brilliant mind herself, but she felt increasingly isolated and unhappy in my shadow. The work I consider my life's masterpiece, The General Theory of Relativity, was finally published in 1915. It was a theory that described gravity not as a force, but as a warping or curving of the fabric of space and time itself. It was the hardest intellectual struggle of my life, taking me almost a decade, and it brought me great joy to complete it. Meanwhile, my marriage had broken down entirely. Maliva and I separated in 1914, and she took our two sons and returned to Zurich. This separation was incredibly difficult, especially being away from my boys. We divorced in 1919. As part of the divorce settlement, I promised Maliva the money from the Nobel Prize I was certain I would eventually win. In 1919, I married my cousin, Elsa Lowenthal. Elsa was a kind, practical, and social woman. She took great care of me and shielded me from the distractions of the outside world, allowing me to focus on my work. Her two daughters from a previous marriage, Ilsa and Margot, became like my own. Global fame, triumph, and lost the moment that catapulted me to global fame was in 1919. A British astronomical expedition, led by Sir Arthur Eddington, had photographed a solar eclipse and confirmed my general theory of relativity. They showed that the light from distant stars was bent by the sun's gravity, exactly as my equations predicted. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines around the world declared a revolution in physics. Overnight, I went from a respected, albeit esoteric, physicist to the most famous scientist in the world. People called me a genius and a visionary, and my face became instantly recognizable. The pressure of this fame was enormous. I was constantly hounded by the press and asked for my opinion on everything from politics to fashion, not just physics. My life was a whirlwind of travel and lectures. I was invited to speak all over the world. My fame brought me the platform to express my deep-seated beliefs. I was a staunch pacifist who abhorred war and a committed Zionist who spoke out in favor of a Jewish homeland. In 1921, I finally received the Nobel Prize in Physics. Ironically, it was awarded not for relativity, which some committee members still found too controversial, but for my earlier work on the photoelectric effect, which helped establish the quantum nature of light. True to my word, I sent the money to Maliva and our sons. As the 1920s progressed, life in Germany became increasingly difficult. The rise of the Nazi Party was terrifying. As a prominent Jew and outspoken liberal, I became a target. My theories were denounced as Jewish science, and my life was under threat. The rising tide of anti Semitism was a sad, frightening development. Exile in America, and later life in 1933, while I was on a trip to the United States, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. I immediately made the painful decision not to return. I resigned my post at the Prussian Academy of Sciences and settled permanently in Princeton, New Jersey, USA, taking a position at the newly formed Institute for Advanced Study. It was an involuntary exile, one of the great sorrows of my life, but I was relieved to be safe. Life in Princeton was calmer. I had a comfortable home and a small office where I spent my days pondering the universe. I never truly mastered English, always speaking it with a thick German accent. I loved sailing my small sailboat, even though I wasn't very good at it and often got stuck on windless days. The biggest tragedy during this period was the decline of my son, Edouard Ted, who suffered from schizophrenia. He had to be institutionalized, and I was unable to visit him much due to the war and my distance. This was a profound sadness for me. In 1939, deeply concerned by the possibility that German scientists were developing an atomic weapon, I signed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, urging the U.S. to begin its own nuclear research. This letter ultimately led to the Manhattan Project. I later regretted this action, as I remained a staunch pacifist and was horrified by the eventual use of the atomic bomb on Japan. I dedicated the rest of my life to promoting international peace and nuclear disarmament. My later years were spent trying, unsuccessfully, to find a unified field theory, a single elegant set of equations that could describe all the forces of nature. It was a noble, but ultimately unrealized dream. Despite all the serious work, I did have a funny side. People often commented on my wild hair and my simple, sometimes eccentric dress sense. I was once asked to sign a document, and for fun, I instead signed a photograph of myself sticking out my tongue. The photographer was celebrating my 72nd birthday and had badgered me into smiling for one last photo. I'd had enough, so I stuck out my tongue. I did it as a joke about my weariness with the public fuss, but it became one of the most famous photos of me, showing the playful, rebellious side of my personality. I loved it so much that I ordered 9 copies for myself. My second wife, Elsa, passed away in 1936, another great loss. I spent my final decades quietly in Princeton, cared for by my stepdaughter Margot and my faithful secretary, Helen Dukas. I was still bombarded with fan mail and requests, but I try to maintain a simple, focused life. I passed away on April 18th, 1955, at the age of 76, from an abdominal aortic aneurysm. I was working right up until the end. I left an unfinished manuscript on my desk. I had instructed that my body be cremated and my ashes scattered in an undisclosed location to prevent my final resting place from becoming a place of pilgrimage. I wanted people to focus on my ideas, not my person. I had a full life, filled with both immense professional joy and deep personal sorrow. I struggled with the rigidity of the world, found solace in the harmony of the universe, and ultimately, I simply followed my curiosity wherever it led. I believe that imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world. Thank you for listening to my story.